room falls silent as footsteps echo across the wooden stage. A solitary figure stands before the microphone, voice steady and clear. Have you ever noticed how the same 24 hours that seem too short for our dreams are plenty long enough for our excuses? That single thought has haunted me for years. You see, we're all given the same precious currency of time, the great equalizer that knows no favorites. Yet some build empires while others build walls of what-ifs and if-onlys. The raw truth is that excuses are the nails used to build the house of failure. Each time we make one, we're hammering another nail into the structure of our own limitations. And the most dangerous part? They feel comfortable, they feel safe. They feel like old friends who understand us, who protect us from the harsh realities of responsibility and risk. But let me ask you something. When was the last time you heard a success story that began with, "I would have, but..." When did you last hear of someone achieving greatness by explaining why they couldn't? Take the story of a young boy from the poorest neighborhood in his city. His mother worked 3 jobs, and there wasn't enough money for proper shoes. Every morning he ran barefoot on the concrete, training for a race nobody thought he could win. His friends told him he was crazy. His teachers said he should focus on getting a regular job. Everyone had a reason why he should quit. You know what he said? Nothing. He just kept running. The day of the city championships arrived, still no shoes. The other runners looked at him with mixture of pity and amusement. The ground was hot enough to fry an egg. But he had trained for this moment. Not just physically, but mentally. He had trained himself to turn every "you can't" into fuel for his internal fire. He won that race. Not because he was the most talented, not because he had the best equipment. He won because while others were perfecting their excuses, he was perfecting his performance. Now, I can see some of you shifting uncomfortably in your seats. You're thinking about your own dreams, aren't you? Those quiet whispers of ambition that you've been silencing with perfectly reasonable explanations. The timing isn't right. The market is too competitive. I don't have the right connections. I'm too old. I'm too young. I don't have enough experience. I have too much to lose. Let's examine these excuses under the harsh light of reality. The timing will never be perfect. The market will always be competitive. Nobody starts with the right connections, they build them. Age is just a number that people use to convince themselves why they can't do something. Experience, you gain it by doing, not by waiting to have it. Consider the small business owner who started with nothing but a recipe passed down through generations. The banks wouldn't loan her money. The retail spaces were too expensive. The competition was too fierce. She had every excuse to give up before she began. Instead, she started selling at local markets. Rain or shine, she was there. When people said her prices were too high, she explained the quality of her ingredients. When the health inspector made things difficult, she studied regulations until she could recite them in her sleep. Today she owns 3 successful stores. Not because the obstacles weren't real, they were very real, but because she refused to let them become excuses. Here's what you need to understand. Excuses are like shadows. They seem substantial, but they have no real weight unless you give it to them. They're illusions that grow stronger every time you acknowledge them. Every time you say, "I can't, because..." You're feeding a monster that will eventually consume all your potential. The things you've accomplished in your life so far. Did you succeed because the conditions were perfect? Or did you succeed because you refused to let imperfect conditions stop you? The human spirit has an extraordinary capacity for achievement when it stops explaining why it can't and starts figuring out how it can. History is filled with examples of people who had every reason to quit but chose to persist. They weren't superhuman, they weren't blessed with special powers. They simply made a decision that their dreams were more important than their excuses. Let me tell you about a teacher I once met. She worked in a school where resources were scarce, morale was low, and the system seemed designed to fail. Her colleagues had 1,000 reasons why their students couldn't succeed. The neighborhood was too rough. The parents weren't involved enough. The curriculum was too rigid. The funding was too low. But this teacher saw something different. She saw potential where others saw problems. When there weren't enough textbooks, she created her own materials. When parents couldn't come to meetings, she went to their homes. When students struggled, she stayed late. She turned every "we can't" into "how can we." 5 years later, her students were outperforming those from schools with twice the resources. The excuses hadn't changed. She had simply refused to accept them as final answers. This is the fundamental difference between champions and everyone else. Champions don't deny the existence of obstacles. They acknowledge them and then transcend them. They understand that the path to success isn't about waiting for the perfect conditions. It's about working with whatever conditions exist. Right now, in this very moment, someone with less talent, fewer resources, and more obstacles than you is pushing forward toward their dreams. They're not waiting for permission. They're not waiting for perfect conditions. They're not crafting eloquent explanations about why they can't succeed. They're simply working, day after day, step by step, failure after failure, learning and adjusting and growing. What separates them from others? One simple choice. They decided that their dreams were non-negotiable. They understood that excuses, no matter how valid they might seem, are simply variables in an equation they need to solve. They're not stop signs. They're detours that require creative navigation. Every morning when you wake up, you make a choice. You might not realize it, but this choice is so fundamental that it shapes every other decision you'll make that day. The choice is simple. Will you live in the world of "I can't because" or the world of "I will despite"? Let me share something profound with you. In a study of thousands of conversations, researchers discovered that the average person makes 21 excuses every day. 21 times we tell ourselves and others why something isn't possible. 21 opportunities lost, 21 dreams deferred, 21 moments where we choose comfort over growth. That number. If you live to be 80 years old, you'll have made over 600,000 excuses in your lifetime. 600,000 times you'll have chosen the easy path over the right one. 600,000 bricks in your wall of limitations. But here's the beautiful truth. You can break this pattern in a single moment. The moment you decide that your excuses are no longer bigger than your dreams. Consider the story of a small manufacturing company facing bankruptcy. Their equipment was outdated. Their competitors were bigger, stronger, better funded. The market was shifting, and every expert said they should close their doors. They had a warehouse full of reasons why failure was inevitable. The workers gathered for what many thought would be their last meeting. But instead of accepting defeat, they asked a different question. Instead of asking why they couldn't succeed, they asked how they could. They examined every excuse and turned it into a challenge to be solved. Outdated equipment. They learned to maintain it better than anyone else, making it run more efficiently than their competitors' newer machines. Bigger competition. They focused on specialized products that larger companies couldn't produce efficiently. Limited resources. They invented new processes that required fewer materials. 1 year later, they hadn't just survived. They were thriving. The same circumstances that could have been their eulogy became their success story. The only thing that changed was their relationship with excuses. This is what champions understand that others don't. Circumstances don't determine outcomes. Responses do. The champion's mind doesn't deny reality. It transforms it. It takes every can't and turns it into a how. Fear for a moment. Fear is the fertile soil where excuses grow. We're afraid of failure, so we say we're not ready. We're afraid of judgment, so we say the timing isn't right. We're afraid of success, so we say we don't deserve it. Fear whispers excuses into our ears, and we repeat them until they sound like wisdom. But what if I told you that fear isn't your enemy? What if those butterflies in your stomach, that tightness in your chest, that voice telling you to stay safe? What if these weren't warning signs but wake-up calls? What if they were simply your dreams knocking on the door of your comfort zone asking to be let out? I once met a man who'd been a salesman for 30 years. Every morning he still felt nervous before his first call. But he taught me something invaluable. He said, I used to make excuses about why I couldn't make those calls. Now I understand. The nervousness isn't telling me to stop. It's telling me I'm about to grow. This is what separates champions from dreamers. Champions don't wait for the fear to go away. They move forward with the fear. They understand that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the triumph over excuses. The excuses you're carrying right now. They might feel like old friends, comfortable and familiar. They might seem logical, reasonable, even prudent. But I want you to do something right now. I want you to give each excuse a price tag. What is it really costing you? That excuse about not having enough education? What opportunities has it kept you from pursuing? That excuse about not having enough time? How many moments of potential growth have you lost? That excuse about not being ready, how long has it kept you standing still while life moves forward? The cost of excuses isn't just in the dreams we don't pursue, it's in the person we don't become. Every time we choose an excuse over action, we're choosing to remain the same person we were yesterday. We're choosing comfort over growth, safety over possibility, mediocrity over excellence. Let me tell you about a woman who ran a small diner in a struggling neighborhood. Every day, someone gave her a new reason to quit. The economy was bad. The neighborhood was changing. The suppliers were unreliable. The staff was untrained. She had every excuse to close her doors and walk away. Instead, she did something remarkable. She started writing down every excuse she heard, not to validate them, but to solve them. The economy was bad. She created budget-friendly specials that brought in new customers. The neighborhood was changing. She learned about her new neighbors' preferences and adapted her menu. Suppliers unreliable. She built relationships with local farmers, staff untrained. She became a teacher. 10 years later, her diner wasn't just surviving, it was the heart of the community. The same circumstances that could have been her excuses became her opportunities. She understood something vital. Excuses are just problems waiting for solutions. This is where true transformation begins. When you stop seeing excuses as walls and start seeing them as doorways. When you stop using them as reasons to quit and start using them as roadmaps for growth. The truth is, every excuse you make is a choice. It's a choice between the person you are and the person you could be. It's a choice between the life you have and the life you want. It's a choice between being a spectator in your own story and being its author. Champions make these choices differently. They understand that excuses are just challenges in disguise. They know that every I can't is really an I won't. And every I won't is a decision to stay exactly where they are. The most dangerous excuses aren't the ones we tell others. They're the ones we tell ourselves. They're the quiet whispers in the morning when we're deciding whether to get up early or hit the snooze button. They're the gentle rationalizations when we're choosing between doing what's easy and doing what's necessary. They're the soft compromises we make with our potential day after day until mediocrity feels like destiny. Let me tell you about a warehouse worker who dreamed of owning his own business. Every day he worked alongside people who had given up on their dreams. They told him he was foolish. They said small businesses always fail. They reminded him that he didn't have enough money, enough education, enough connections. They offered him 1,000 reasons why he should stay exactly where he was. But he did something remarkable. Every time he heard an excuse, he wrote it down. Not to believe it, but to defeat it. No money. He saved every extra penny and learned about bootstrapping, no education. He spent his lunch breaks reading business books, no connections. He started networking at local business meetings after his shifts. 3 years later, he hadn't just started a business, he had created opportunities for the very people who said it couldn't be done. He hired them, trained them, showed them what was possible when you refused to accept excuses as final answers. This is the power of turning excuses into action plans. Every I can't because becomes I will, and here's how. Every limitation becomes a lesson. Every obstacle becomes an opportunity. But let's be honest, this isn't easy. The path of excuses is comfortable, it's well-worn, it's socially acceptable. Nobody criticizes you for having reasonable doubts. Nobody challenges you for playing it safe. The world understands and accepts your excuses, and that's exactly why champions are rare. They choose the uncomfortable truth over the comfortable excuse. They choose the painful growth over the painless stagnation. They choose the uncertain path over the guaranteed mediocrity. The mental conversations you have with yourself, those private moments when you're deciding whether to take a risk or play it safe, what voice do you listen to? The one that offers excuses or the one that demands excellence? I once knew a drama teacher in a small-town school. The auditorium was falling apart. The budget was nearly non-existent. The community didn't support the arts. She had every excuse to do mediocre work. Instead, she looked at what she had rather than what she lacked. No budget for sets? She taught her students to create scenes with movement and imagination. No money for costumes? She organized a community sewing circle. No support? She invited local businesses to sponsored shows. Within 2 years, her students were performing at a level that made people forget about the peeling paint and broken seats. They created magic not because they had everything they needed, but because they refused to let what they lacked become an excuse. This is the mindset that separates champions from spectators. Champions don't wait for perfect conditions. They perfect their response to existing conditions. They don't wish for fewer problems. They develop greater capacity to solve problems. They don't complain about what they lack. They maximize what they have. Consider this. Every excuse you accept today becomes a limitation you live with tomorrow. Every time you say, "I can't because," you're programming your mind to look for obstacles instead of opportunities. You're training yourself to find reasons why things won't work instead of ways to make them work. But what if you made a different choice? What if just for one day you banned excuses from your vocabulary? What if for 24 hours you replaced every "I can't" with "How can I?" What would change? Let me tell you about a small retail store owner during the worst recession in decades. Every morning brought news of another business closing. His suppliers were raising prices. His customers were spending less. His competitors were slashing prices below cost. He had every rational reason to give up. Instead, he gathered his staff and said, "We can't control the economy, but we can control our response to it. We can't change our circumstances, but we can change ourselves." They stopped focusing on what they couldn't do and started focusing on what they could. They couldn't compete on price. They competed on service. They couldn't afford advertising. They turned their customers into advertisers through exceptional experiences. They couldn't match the big store's inventory. They became experts at finding exactly what each customer needed. By the end of the year, while other stores were closing, they had grown. Not because the circumstances were different, but because their response was different. They chose possibility over limitation, action over excuse. This is the secret that champions understand. The circumstances of your life are not the definition of your life. Your response to those circumstances, that's what defines you. Every champion has faced obstacles. Every success story includes chapters of doubt, limitation, and seeming impossibility. The difference is in the response. Where others see walls, champions see challenges. Where others find excuses, champions find ways. Where others stop, champions start asking better questions. The dreams you've put on hold, the goals you've postponed, the potential you've left untapped. What excuses are holding these hostage? What stories are you telling yourself about why you can't move forward? Now imagine those same circumstances through the eyes of a champion. See how every obstacle becomes a challenge to overcome. See how every limitation becomes an invitation to innovate. See how every excuse becomes an opportunity to prove what's possible. There's a moment in every person's life when they stand at a crossroads. On one side lies the comfortable path of excuses, well-worn and predictable. On the other lies the challenging path of growth, uncertain but full of possibility. The choice you make in that moment, that single decisive moment, can alter the entire course of your life. Consider the story of a young boxer training in a rundown gym. The equipment was old, the roof leaked, and the heating didn't work in winter. Every morning he had to break the ice in his water bucket before he could train. His friends told him he was wasting his time. His family worried he was chasing an impossible dream. Society said he should get a real job. He had every excuse to quit. Instead, he did something extraordinary. He turned every excuse into an advantage. Old equipment? It taught him to adapt. Cold gym. It built his mental toughness. No support? It fueled his determination. He didn't just train his body, he trained his mind to see obstacles as opportunities. When he finally got his shot at the title, nobody gave him a chance. His opponent had trained in state-of-the-art facilities with the best coaches money could buy. But something interesting happened in that ring. All those months of turning excuses into fuel, all those hours of choosing discipline over comfort, they had built something more valuable than perfect conditions ever could. They had built an unshakable spirit. He won that fight. Not because he was more talented, but because he had learned to thrive in adversity. Every excuse he had refused to accept had become a foundation stone of his success. This is what we need to understand about excuses. They're not just words we say, they're choices we make. Every time we accept an excuse, we're choosing to stay within our current limitations. Every time we reject an excuse, we're choosing to expand our possibilities. The excuses you've been carrying, maybe you've had them so long they feel like part of your identity. I'm not good with numbers. I'm not a morning person. I'm too old to start something new. I'm not lucky enough. These aren't just statements, they're self-imposed prison walls. But what if these walls are made of paper? What if they only have the strength we give them? What if they're not protecting us from failure, but from our own potential? Let me share something powerful with you. In a study of successful people across different fields, researchers found something fascinating. These high achievers didn't have fewer problems than others. They didn't have better circumstances. They didn't have more talent. What they had was a different relationship with excuses. When faced with an obstacle, average performers spent their energy explaining why they couldn't succeed. High performers spent their energy finding ways they could. Same circumstances, different response. Same obstacles, different mindset. This is why champions seem to operate in a different reality. They're not seeing different circumstances, they're seeing the same circumstances through different eyes. Where others see impossibility, they see opportunity. Where others see endings, they see beginnings. Take the story of a small factory facing foreign competition. Their competitors had cheaper labor, newer equipment, and bigger budgets. The management team had a file folder thick with reasons why they couldn't compete. But they had one person who refused to accept excuses. This person started asking different questions. Instead of asking why they couldn't compete on price, she asked how they could compete on quality. Instead of focusing on what they lacked, she focused on what they had. Skilled workers who took pride in their craft, deep relationships with customers, and decades of experience. They couldn't match their competitors' prices, so they stopped trying. Instead, they became the premium option in their market. They couldn't afford the newest equipment, so they became masters at maintaining and maximizing their existing machinery. They couldn't compete on volume, so they specialized in custom orders that bigger factories couldn't handle efficiently. Within 2 years, they weren't just surviving, they were thriving. The same circumstances that could have been their excuse became their advantage. The same limitations that could have defeated them became their differentiation. This is the alchemy that champions perform. They turn excuses into expertise. They transform limitations into leverage. They convert obstacles into opportunities. But let's be clear, this isn't about positive thinking. This isn't about denying reality. Champions don't pretend obstacles don't exist. They simply refuse to let obstacles have the final word. They don't ignore their limitations. They work to expand them. They don't dismiss their fears. They use them as fuel. The most common excuse you make. The one that feels the most reasonable, the most justified. Now ask yourself, what if this excuse is actually pointing you toward your next breakthrough? What if this limitation is actually highlighting your next area of growth? Consider the story of a public speaker who stuttered. He had every reason to choose a different path. People told him he was in the wrong profession. They said he should accept his limitations. They offered him 1,000 reasonable excuses to quit. Instead, he studied how different sounds affected his stutter. He learned breathing techniques that helped him manage it. He developed a style of speaking that turned his pause patterns into powerful dramatic effects. He didn't overcome his stutter. He incorporated it into his uniqueness. Today, he's one of the most compelling speakers in his field, not because he doesn't stutter anymore, He still does, but because he refused to let his stutter become an excuse. He turned what could have been his greatest limitation into his greatest distinction. We stand now at the edge of transformation. Everything we've discussed, every story, every insight, every truth, brings us to this crucial moment. The moment when knowledge must become action. The moment when understanding must become change. Let me share something profound with you. On a cold winter morning, a group of researchers conducted an experiment. They studied two groups of people facing identical challenges. Both groups had the same obstacles, the same limitations, the same apparent reasons why they couldn't succeed. But they told one group something different. They told them that obstacles were signs of importance, that the presence of challenges indicated they were on a worthy path. The results were astonishing. The group that saw obstacles as validation consistently outperformed those who saw them as limitations. Same circumstances, different mindset, different results. This is the secret hidden in plain sight. Your excuses aren't protecting you from failure. They're protecting you from success. They're not keeping you safe, they're keeping you small. Every time you accept an excuse, you're trading your potential for temporary comfort. The great achievements in human history, the first flight across the ocean, the first expedition to climb the highest peaks, the first steps toward curing diseases that were once thought incurable. Every single breakthrough began with someone who refused to accept the prevailing excuses of their time. They didn't have better circumstances than their contemporaries. They didn't have fewer obstacles. What they had was an unshakable commitment to find a way forward. They understood something vital, that excuses are the graveyard where dreams go to die. Let me tell you about a small choir in a struggling community. They had no budget, no proper facilities, and most of their members couldn't read music. Every expert said they needed proper training, better equipment, more resources. They had a file cabinet full of reasons why they couldn't compete with more established groups. But they had a director who understood something powerful. She said, "We can't wait for perfect conditions. We have to perfect ourselves within our conditions." They couldn't afford sheet music. They developed their ear training. They couldn't pay for a proper venue. They practiced in parks and street corners, learning to project their voices naturally. They couldn't compete with polished performances. They focused on raw emotion and authentic connection. When they finally entered their first competition, something magical happened. Their limitations hadn't defeated them, they had defined them. Their struggles hadn't weakened them, they had strengthened them. They didn't win because they had the most resources, they won because they had the most heart. This is the transformation that becomes possible when you stop using circumstances as excuses and start using them as catalysts. When you stop asking, "Why me?" and start asking, "What's next?" When you stop waiting for conditions to be perfect and start perfecting your response to conditions as they are. Champions aren't born, they're forged. Forged in the furnace of adversity. Forged by the hammer of challenges. Forged through the conscious decision to reject excuses and embrace responsibility. Every time you catch yourself saying, "I can't because," stop and add these words, "but I will because." Feel the difference in energy. Feel the shift in possibility. Feel the power that comes from turning excuses into fuel for growth. The truth is, you already have everything you need to begin. You have the same 24 hours that every champion in history had. You have the same capacity for determination that every success story started with. You have the same ability to choose growth over comfort, possibility over limitation, action over excuse. What you do with these resources, that's the only difference. That's the decision that separates champions from spectators. That's the choice that determines whether your potential becomes reality or remains forever locked in the prison of what if. Remember the warehouse worker who built a business. Remember the teacher who transformed her struggling drama program. Remember the small factory that turned limitations into advantages. They weren't special, they were specific. Specific in their commitment to reject excuses. Specific in their determination to find solutions. Specific in their choice to build rather than blame. This is your moment, right here, right now. The moment when you decide whether your dreams are bigger than your excuses. The moment when you choose whether your potential is more important than your comfort. The moment when you determine whether your future will be built on foundations of action or on foundations of excuse. Every excuse you've ever made has led you to this point. Every limitation you've accepted has brought you to this crossroads. Every reason why you couldn't has prepared you for the moment when you decide that you will. The world doesn't need more people who are good at making excuses. It needs people who are good at making progress. It doesn't need more voices explaining why things can't be done. It needs more spirits determined to find ways they can be done. The question isn't whether you have what it takes. The question is whether you'll take what you have and make it enough. The question isn't whether your circumstances are perfect. The question is whether your commitment is unshakable. Champions aren't people who never face obstacles. They're people who never accept excuses. They're not individuals who have everything they need. They're individuals who make the most of everything they have. They're not people without fear. They're people who feel the fear and choose courage anyway. As you leave here today, you'll face a choice. You'll return to the same circumstances you left behind. You'll encounter the same obstacles, the same limitations, the same reasons why you can't. But you'll carry with you a new understanding that these aren't your prison walls unless you decide they are. Every excuse you've been carrying is waiting to see what you'll do. Every limitation you've accepted is waiting to see if you'll challenge it. Every I can't is waiting to become I will. The time for excuses is over. The time for transformation is now. Your life is waiting to see what you'll choose. Your potential is waiting to see if you'll release it. Your future is waiting to see if you'll create it. Remember, excuses don't build champions. Action builds champions. Determination builds champions. The unwavering decision to find a way forward no matter what, that builds champions. The choice is yours. The time is now. The question isn't whether you can. The question is whether you will. What's it going to be?